Good afternoon. I'm excited to share my research with you all. I think that there are maybe two things that all politicians can agree on. That first thing is that policy matters. And policy matters because people matter. Policies and the lack of policies can completely change the trajectory of a person's life, of a community, even an entire country. If it weren't for policy changes that happened in the past century, I wouldn't be here standing in front of you guys speaking today. When we realize just how much policies matter and the lack of policies, it becomes essential that we can track and measure what changes we're seeing and what changes are happening when it comes to policies. Within political science, there are tons of theories that try to understand where, when, why, and how we'll see policies change and legislators start to pay attention to different policy topics. My research is along these lines where I try to question where and when do we see shifts in legislative attention to race specifically. When understanding legislative attention, I kind of think about legislators almost like procrastinating students on TikTok. Now hear me out. Just like TikTok, the legislative agenda has tons and tons of different topics. There's so many things that are vying for our attention all the time, waiting for us to like, to share, and to comment. And with all these different things vying for our attention, it takes the right set of conditions for us to stop and actually engage. Political scientists have theorized the things that will get legislators to stop and engage for topics like tobacco policy or transportation policy. But we haven't paid a lot of attention to the specific conditions that are necessary for people to pay attention to racial policies. The few works that have tried to understand legislative attention to race would put all of the bills for welfare into one bucket or all the bills for criminal justice into one bucket and just say if we see an increase in these bills, people are talking about race. My work tries to go a step further. I use text analysis so that we don't just look at policy domains, we look at the contents of each and every single bill. Text analysis is a super fun strategy where we take unstructured data, so the tons and tons of bills that you see over here, and then we have them grouped into different categories based on the words that we see in the bills. After we have different categories, we can then turn this text into much more meaningful data. And this is what I do with my project. I group words into categories based on whether they're racialized or not. And thinking about racialization, I'm able to create what I call the racialized language hierarchy. When I say racialization, I'm talking about a process where racial meanings are extended to previously unclassified relationships, recognizing that race is in fact a social construct. When we think about racialization, we're thinking about the emergence of race as an idea and how it's also been transferred to new words and new phrases. We can take racial policy, we can take racial profiling, for example. When this emerged, we automatically knew that it had racial meanings and racial connotations. When we take a word like body cameras, which is a newer technology, we know that it's become racialized over time as it's been associated with social movements. What the racialized language hierarchy, a tool that I created, does is it measures the presence of over 800 different words that are known to have racial meaning in policy. And then we're able to detect and track when they appear and when they disappear from policies. I want to take you through what I found with just one state. I picked the state of South Carolina to talk to you guys about today because I thought that with South Carolina, we would see a huge increase in the ways that people were talking about race after 2015. I thought that after a white supremacist walked into a black church and killed 9 black people, state legislators would be using racialized words all the time, that we'd see bills and resolutions about racial justice proliferate the legislature. But that's not quite what I found. I did see that racialized words, meaning that the texts that are using words about race, it was increasing in South Carolina bills over time. I did find that they're using specifically explicitly racialized words like African American more over time as well, whereas implicitly racialized words are staying relatively steady over time. But what I found that was a little bit surprising is that not all types of bills are talking about race in the same ways, at the same levels. Resolutions are a type of bill that is mostly symbolic. It can commend an individual, it can talk about an event, but it doesn't carry the full weight of policies like bills. Bills, on the other hand, are much more substantive. The few racialized bills that I saw talked about things like racial profiling, decreasing hate crimes. They talked about giving resources to minority-owned businesses. But we're not seeing an increase in these types of policies in South Carolina. One of the other findings that I'd like to share is that I found that policies that were being proposed by Black lawmakers specifically were not being passed at the same rates as policies that were being proposed by white legislators. And this raises a huge concern when we think about the representation of their constituents. For the majority of these individuals, their constituents are Black constituents and people of color who have questions about their representation if their legislators can't get bills that they need passed. So what does all this mean? It means that yes, state legislatures are talking about race more, but they're doing it in mostly symbolic policies. These symbolic policies are meaningful, but they don't carry the full potential that bills do. Bills have a potential to actually change the everyday lived realities of people who are Black inside of the state. 3 years ago, one of the resolutions that I read said that South Carolina has the desire to address the threats that they see to Black Americans. By focusing on the words, we have a chance to actually measure if this desire is being enacted. We have a chance to see if these bills and resolutions are truly talking about race, and then later influencing the lives of Black Americans in South Carolina and beyond. Today, I began by sharing there are 2 things that I think most politicians will agree upon. That first thing was policy matters. And that second thing is that change is happening. While reading through tons and tons of bills, I saw changes between 2010 and 2020. There were changes in the lawmakers, there were changes in the legislatures, changes in the ideologies and in the issues that they were talking about. While it presented a somewhat bleak image showing that yes, they're talking about race more, but they're only doing it in mostly symbolic ways, the fact that they are talking about race in symbolic ways, it does matter. And it's a change that we didn't see, say, 15 years ago or 20 years ago. Through text analysis, I'm finding even more ways that the legislatures across the country are paying more attention to race, and in some ways less attention to race. But for all that information, you'll have to read my full dissertation, which is not yet complete. But until then, I thank you guys so much for your time, and I thank you for your attention.